Susanna. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to a Whitford audience again. I attended the first one and some of the previous ones, and I always love these forums. However, being the last speaker, I'm a little bit in a disadvantage. Having heard 5 distinguished keynote speeches so far and so many research papers, it's a little bit difficult to keep your attention, let alone to impress you. And I do not even have beautiful pictures of birds and frogs like Avgerou. Still, I have an advantage, being last, that I have heard my predecessor speakers, and therefore I can indulge in making some comments. Now, the digital revolution. Some call it the 4th industrial revolution. One way or another, ever since I started my jobs, I don't want to tell you how many decades ago, we have been talking about the revolution, the computer revolution, the information society revolution, etc., etc. Now, I think this time there is a new audacity in this discourse about the digital innovation and the revolutionary effects it has. The last World Economic Forum in Davos was dedicated to the possibly revolutionary effects on the economy of digital innovation. But for me, the quotation and the speeches that somehow capture the revolutionary kind of imagination and urgency that digital innovation conveys nowadays comes from the sociologist Anthony Giddens. And he's quite an influential sociologist in the UK and the Anglo-Saxon world at least. And for a couple of years now, he gives these speeches about the digital revolution, the technology revolution, and the way he presents it is that it is a mix of high opportunities and risks resulting from the integration of supercomputers, the internet, and robotics. And he somehow talks in length about the way these innovations, technology innovations, are going to change, transform potentially everything in societies. And here is the quotation that I think captures the importance of it. Humanity faces a future between immortality and Armageddon. Immortality, I don't know if anybody here has read the ideas about singularity. Perhaps we should add on the tree that Professor Eric Mata presented earlier on today of the various species on the world. We may need to add some new branches about cyborgs, about the way we create new species, hybrids of human flesh and mind and technology. So with prosthetics, we prolong our lives. We are nearer this desire of humanity to achieve immortality. On the other hand, we also hear and we are aware that there are potentially huge risks here. We are talking about intelligent machines, so intelligent in fact that they self-learn. Now, if they self-learn, who knows what they're going to do? So as a species, even as a cyborg species, we may lose the control that for millennia we tried to build on the planet. And immortality and Armageddons are for gods, and we are not even gods. So it's a little bit tricky, but I'm going to talk a little bit more down-to-earth kind of possibilities, referring to major economic changes. And there we are on more familiar ground. Possibilities, and this is not by any means an exhaustive list, include productivity increases. Well, Gabriela kept asking almost all speakers, why productivity? Productivity is the economist's holy grail. There may be other indicators, but productivity is extremely important for creating wealth, and I somehow accept that this is very important, particularly for development, in the sense that if there are large portions of the population to be lifted out of poverty, you do need to create growth. And productivity is a significant way for creating growth. There are also potential ways of, alternative ways of creating growth, not through productivity, not just by achieving efficiencies, which kind to come intuitively to our mind that machines do things faster and therefore create efficiency, and in that way we produce more with the same inputs, and therefore we can reduce cost and have cost and price advantages. There are alternative ways of competing, there are alternative ways of entering the production process, and this creates opportunities for development. I'm going to say some more on this a bit later. On the other hand, there is a potential of huge mass unemployment because of the intelligent machines. You remember the robotics, the third component of the integrated innovation channels that Tony Giddens mentioned. And if this is going to be materialized, we are not talking perhaps about some kind of temporary increase of unemployment which will go away on its own, as it has happened perhaps recently with previous increases of productivity through downsizing, that is, by shedding labor. We are talking about whole ranges of professions like accountants, lawyers, us, lecturers at the universities, who may just become redundant. Just the MOOCs that we have heard from a number of speakers so far. Indeed, if there are ways of getting access to the best quality lectures and material from the top universities of the world, why should one pay fees to go to a mediocre kind of university and hear mediocre kind of lecturers for 3 years? It just doesn't quite make sense. Or probably does, but that's something that we will discover. Now, all these changes, huge increase in productivity, interesting new ways of creating business and wealth, potentially mass unemployment. Will it happen? There have been previous predictions, which, I mean, really, the history of computing is littered with predictions that didn't quite materialize, while major innovations and changes we were not able to predict. We couldn't predict the internet. It just happened. Even when the internet happened, we were slow to predict the kind of impact that we realize now that it is having. The problem with the difficulty of prediction is very much related with this almost intuitive tendency we have for what is known as technology determinism. That is, to be able to make decisions or conclusions of what is going to happen or what is happening on the basis of the properties of the technology. The technology processes information fast, therefore, if I have access to technology, where I'm going to have, as a result, productivity. We had an example today. Is Amin here? Amin mentioned, yeah, the example of the Bangladesh. Increase of growth, 2% by the spread, because it was quoted of the spread, the diffusion of mobile phones. This makes me a little bit uneasy in the sense that it suggests that technology diffuses and there will be these results as caused by the technology. It's not exactly like this. The causality is still fuzzy. we are not quite sure, even if we have made the measurements in Bangladesh and in other places of the world, and we found that before we had mobiles, we had a certain level of output, GDP, and after we had a different one, perhaps higher. But to make this causality and attribute it to mobile phones without taking into account that probably other things happened as well is, to me, not a very good science, to say the least, and it may be misleading. So there are all sorts of earlier predictions that were made on the basis of what technology can do, which didn't quite materialize. And I want to come back to the issue of productivity. Productivity, which is the most intuitive way to associate the effects of information technology with growth, actually puzzled the economists. Have you heard about the productivity paradox? Productivity paradox is an expression that really sent shock waves around the IT professionals and managers who invested heavily in technology. That was at the late 80s when they realized that with continuous heavy investment in computer technology at that time, the economists expected to see in their statistics growth, productivity increases, and they couldn't find them. So they had to explain the paradox. One of the explanations, which for me is the most important, is that on its own, investment in information technology, adopting the innovation, diffusing new technologies, does not lead to productivity or any other possible effect for that matter. But let's stick to productivity. What we learned, and actually Mr. Atkinson in his talk mentioned it, but he mentioned it in passing, while I think it is extremely important, is that to have productivity effects, you must reorganize. You must change the way you organize your production, your distribution, your supply chains, the whole industry, the whole economy. Now, that's not a small thing. Has anybody done any research in the public sector, for example, which is very often highlighted as being unproductive or not as productive as in comparison with the private sector very often in many countries? Do you know how difficult it is to really reform and change the way the public sector works? We are talking about this kind of difficulties. So it's not a matter of technology, and we'll tweak the way we organize as well. We are talking about deep social changes, hugely political issues. And by the way, after years, the American economists heralded that, hey, the American economy now has reorganized and has achieved productivity at last. Well, it's other countries, Europe cannot put its act together, as we heard from Mr. Atkinson, and the rest of the world even worse, that they are not capable of adopting best practice. They do not organize, they do not benefit from potential productivity effects of technology. Well, last month, a number of newspapers, the Financial Times in London, The Economist, I'm sorry I'm giving examples of British press because that's where I live, they mentioned, and they made big, headlines that actually we continue to have productivity problems. We are in the middle of the digital revolution. We spend millions, billions in new technologies, and productivity effects are very difficult to find. In many ways, in many countries, the economy is quite stagnant. Now, this is the kind of fallacy that we might have if we just try to judge intuitive effects like productivity on the basis of what technology itself can do. We can have very wrong causality. It is extremely important to be able to understand in more depth what other things are needed in order to be able to achieve certain changes, what these changes will be, are going to be, why they may not actually materialize. So all these revolutionary effects may not happen or may not happen fast. And if they are not happen fast, it's not a revolution, it's probably a more normal pace of change, which will give us time to think, to adjust, to develop institutions, etc. And to my mind, this may be a better way of learning to live with the new technologies. I want now to come to the developing countries more specifically and ask what does all of this mean for developing countries. First of all, I want to start by noticing that by now there are many developing countries or many parts of developing countries, if not developing countries as whole societies, that have huge capabilities of taking part in the digital revolution and being able to capitalize from digital innovation. We heard and we know that it is increasing diffusion of the internet. Okay, it's not 100%, but developing countries are not internet deserts. There is this mobile phone diffusion much higher, more than 100% we heard. Again, this may not be smartphones, and this is quite a serious disadvantage, but there is quite a lot of development in the production of affordable smartphones as well, and we may be able to conquer this difficulty in the near future. Developing countries already participate in global supply chains in many industries, in particular manufacturing, and that's very important. And, of course, in the information services themselves, developing countries, many developing countries, have become hubs. So much so that advanced countries are very often alarmed that they lose jobs to developing countries. How horrible, they have unemployment. Developing countries steal their jobs. So there is potential there. We have learned a lot. We have already conquered quite a lot of a prominent position in a digital economy, the global digital economy. But developing countries have also serious disadvantages. Not that these do not exist in the advanced industrialized countries, but they are much more prominent in developing countries. That there are very large parts of the population that are unable to perform socio-economic activities in digital context. I'll give you an example of my country of origin. I was born and raised in Greece. And whenever I go, and of course I go very frequently, and I travel not only in Athens, but in the rural areas and other provinces, and I have difficulty using my credit card. It's a society that doesn't use credit cards. Now, you cannot have e-commerce without a habit of people having credit cards and having also the safeguards of using credit cards securely. And these are traditions that do not change very often. Well, life is strange very often. I'm sure you have heard about the economic crisis that has hit Greece, and it reached its more potent situation when they had capital controls. Capital controls means that they cannot get more than, I don't remember now, a number of euros per week. So having a credit card helps, because in that way can make transfers and payments by bypassing the cash kind of payments. But this gives you a very simple, tangible examples why in many countries the population is not quite ready to fully participate in an economy which doesn't have just digital gadgets, infrastructures, but it has digital institutions like ways that we pay, we get credit, etc. So there are digital development in advanced post-industrial countries may pose serious challenges for developing countries, and I will mention some of them later. In short, yes, there are possibilities for developing countries, and developing countries have the capacity to exploit them, but there are risks, and they are very important. I'll go to talk a little bit first about one major risk that really worries me. It worries me a lot. And then I'll set it aside and I'll talk about more optimistic things about opportunities. What really worries me is the deindustrialization, is the intelligent machines, it's the robots. There was, of course, it's not the first time that we predict somehow losing jobs because of intelligent machines. I remember when I was a young professional, went to London, I was doing my PhD, and at that time there was an advisory meetings with ministers in the UK, which spent a lot of time deliberating the following. How can we do in a society where we don't need to work that much because there will be machines that will do the jobs? How can we learn to live with a lot of leisure time? I don't know about you, it didn't happen in where I work, where I live. I ended up working more and more hours, and everybody around me either works more and more hours or is unemployed. So this, a policy puzzle, what do we do? How do we learn to live fulfilled lives if we don't have a lot of work to do? Because at that time of artificial intelligence and expert systems didn't happen so far in my lifetime. But the fact that it hasn't happened until now doesn't mean that it will not happen. If it happens, it's going to hit developing countries very badly. It means that all those jobs that are outsourced, the production that is outsourced by major industrial nations like Germany, like the US, to developing countries may be lost. And this is going to hit lots of people. Well, I'm going to make a few recommendations here and there, knowing that they are controversial, and they are deliberate to be controversial, because I want to really pass the message to you that we really need, if indeed we are in the middle of a revolution in the economy and the society, we really need to dare to think differently for things that so far we have considered as the right thing to do. Maybe we may need to reconsider. So, one of the things, if indeed they are going to be very soon and in a very fast pace, effects of huge unemployment hitting countries or industrial sectors, I would dare to say that we need regulation to delay this automation. Now, I know that nowadays the last thing we want to hear is that innovation will have a break. All we hear is innovation is good. Be fast, be the first to innovate. Make sure that you innovate everywhere. And here I'm telling you, well, we need regulation perhaps to slow down. If it's going to have effects for which we don't still have the institutions. I'll give you an example which is indeed controversial of Uber. Uber, all the middle classes, including me in London, I really enjoy having easier taxi opportunities, using taxis. I didn't use taxis very much until a few years ago. They were expensive and cumbersome. And now they are cheaper, and they arrive immediately. But London was famous for its taxi drivers. Taxi drivers in London used to have many years of training to know all the streets of London and offer a high-quality service, the best taxi drivers of the world they were proud to be. And suddenly, they're unemployed. In Paris, too. And similar things might happen in other industries, in other parts of the world. And I think we need to protect these jobs. And it's not just off the top of my head that I'm saying that. If you go and read some economic history, and to my mind, the best economic historian is Karl Polanyi, you will read how innovations, radical innovations, in other periods, historical periods, created really havoc in societies. And societies really didn't recover, and they declined because of innovation, rather than really prosper. So innovation may have devastating effects in economies and societies. And what we need to do is to work in parallel with implementing the innovation to develop the institutions that will take care of, that will be appropriate for the new socio-economic regime. Of course, less radical, if there is, or if we can start seeing radical unemployment effects in certain sectors, it's extremely important to start thinking which other sectors will be able to create jobs and income creation. So that's for the deindustrialization. And I would say, really watch carefully this space. Ask your policymakers to be vigilant on that, because if indeed machine intelligence becomes widespread, then it's going to have huge effects on the availability of jobs. And developing countries are very fragile in terms of the jobs that they offer. Only in some sectors, perhaps they over-rely on some sectors, they are much more vulnerable, and they need to start preparing for a transformation. Opportunities, to be a little bit more optimistic. There are sectors that so far have not been affected that very much from the digital technologies, computer technologies, IT, and there are new opportunities, and one of them is agriculture. I think we have already heard agriculture examples from, for example, this morning's speaker on IoT. And somehow it hit me last year when I was doing research in Tabasco in South Mexico. And I was told, actually I went there to study the distribution effects of the internet and mobile phones. But instead of that, what I heard is that there is potential of using RFID technologies to, first of all, be able to monitor the crops, to be able to spot diseases at an early stage and before they spread, to be able, therefore, to address it, also to be able to pick the crop at its very best if you have somehow planted on each corn a little chip that will tell you when it has reached its best state for being picked. And these technologies may soon be not very expensive, and they can improve not only the production, the quantity, but also the quality, which will improve the production of agricultural crops. And let's think about it. One of the types of production that is not predicted at the moment at all that there will be less need of, on the contrary, that it might become a scarce kind of production, is food. And developing countries have huge advantages in that area if indeed they innovate in a clever way. So there are other possibilities of, for example, and these are all ideas that I picked last year from my research in Mexico, where producers exchange knowledge over the internet. They learn how to diversify to new crops, and in that way they create new sources of income. Let me come to the third one, which is the access to the markets, and I think that's where we have another myth. And that's the myth of somehow through the internet we get rid of the middleman. No, we don't. And we don't need to. Actually, that was the research I went to do there, to actually check whether indeed with mobile phones, the smallholders, the producers, can bypass the middleman and just access the market. And I realized that actually the middlemen, that's what they told me, do lots and lots of services. It's not that necessarily they act as middlemen and they take the profit and they allow less of it to go to the producers. But there is something else that we heard about getting rid of the mediators from other industries. With information technology, with platforms, you don't get rid of the mediators. Yes, you disintermediate at the beginning from the traditional mediators, but then there is reintermediation, and this is digital mediators. Look what happened in the travel industry. The high street travel agent, has become obsolete. We all buy tourist services, buy our tickets, book our hotels electronically. But that's not directly me as a consumer to the service provider, the hotel. It's through TripAdvisor or Booking.com. So we have the reintermediation. And you know what? These new mediators tend to be somewhere else in the US or another country. And therefore, we need to be a little bit more careful when we think about the immediate effects. When we go closer, we may find that it's a little bit different. Other opportunities. I think there are huge opportunities in entrepreneurship with the digital business ecosystems. And I think the major new thing that we need to understand, we need to research, we need to teach, we need to create awareness about, is how we create business activities on digital business ecosystems. Here, I will mention another research that I did, which I learned so much from, and that was in China. It seems to me that most, at least in the UK, the most things that we hear about the economy of China is that it has those giant corporations, very many of them controlled by the state. When I went to do my research in China, I found a huge engine of growth which was at the grassroots levels. Micro-entrepreneurs, they call them netpreneurs. That is people starting doing business on the internet. But what does it mean on the internet? On e-commerce platforms, and in particular at that time Taobao, there is now more. For example, the WeChat app of Tencent. Now, this is a very interesting phenomenon. These platforms are extremely important. They were important not only because they created an environment and they had tools for people who hadn't done business before to start opening a shop, to start selling their furniture as communities, as individuals, but something else. The offline efforts that Taobao, the platform provider, did to create these capabilities. So you see, we do not just live virtual lives. The offline is very important. And what I found was communities where the Taobao platform provider was not just a virtual environment. It had representatives. It has people in, flesh and blood go around and organize seminars. And there was a Taobao college, and there was support to the entrepreneurs, whole communities, to start doing business on their platform. I went again 5 years later, and those communities had become huge towns. Well, these are the economies of scale, of course, of China creates, and you might say that Costa Rica is too small for that, but Latin America is not. And you speak the same language. And there are opportunities there. It's a matter of studying this area, understanding them, and creating these opportunities. And of course, needless to say, that the Chinese government is pulling a few strings there in the right kind of way. Of course, there are the international platforms, and it is very important that we seek employment in the international job labor platforms, and we exploit other opportunities as well, which is my second point there. I want to finish with a couple of recommendations of policy areas. Again, some of them may be controversial. The first one is education, education, education. That's nothing new. So many sessions here were devoted to education. We heard about the Seoul Accord, absolutely important. But I would like to highlight a different aspect of education, which is much more difficult. Yes, of course, we need to provide training and to have digital skills and business doing skills. But there is another much more difficult thing for our education today, which is critical judgment. And never before critical judgment was as important as today. Last week's Economist in Europe had as its major theme, with big titles, the age of post-truth. Post-truth means that we are so very much likely to be deceived. And you know our wonderful technologies play a role in that. On the internet, there are so many conspiracy theories. The internet becomes an echo chamber that people with similar ideas magnify their fears or their ideas, and very often they are not that very positive. I'll give you an example, again from the UK. The UK right now is trying to understand what happened to it since it had the referendum and it was decided that it has to get out of the EU. And it tries to understand also why did we end up like that. And it realizes that so many lies were said in the pre-referendum campaign. I'll give you one example. One very major, very impressive pictures of a large number, a huge queue of people waiting. That's how it was presented by those who wanted Brexit to enter the country. And it was presented by those politicians as, here is the risk of uncontrolled immigration, which we have so long as we are in the EU. So people understood that these are immigrants from the EU without us having any possibility of having any control that enter in our country. The picture was not from immigrants, was not for people who were dying to come and steal the jobs of the Brits. It was of refugees who were fleeing war. They were not from the borders of the UK. They were the borders of other parts of the EU where they were waiting to be given refugees asylum. And the fact that they were not coming from the EU is very important, because even if Britain gets out of the EU, still it will have the problem of the unfortunate people of the world knocking at its door. So, complete distortion of one image, but a powerful image, and it played with the fears of the Brits that, for their own political reasons, feel disadvantaged, and probably they are. So that's why I'm saying, what kind of education is it needed for people like the British people to be able to understand that this is untrue, this is misinformation? I need to judge and say, what exactly is happening here? And we need to constantly do this with everything we hear on the internet, in discussions regarding digital revolution, and of course, lots of other things in our political and social life. So education, but it's not as easy. Why don't we create skills? That's what we must do. Actually, we're not quite sure how we develop critical judgment, but we have to try. The other thing is regulation. And regulation, again, is not just in one street avenue. There are areas that we need to deregulate, but there are areas that we definitely need to regulate. Privacy and security, it's a very explosive mix. We are not quite sure how we can safeguard our privacy, but at the same time, cybersecurity is a huge issue. On some issues, they coincide. On many issues, they are one against the other. And finally, I believe that to the extent that the digital revolution doesn't have national borders, we need institutions and new ideas that really safeguard or promote the well-being across the globe. I mentioned already delay in automation. That's something which I really think we need to start thinking about, and how in parallel we develop institutions. Again, Mr. Atkinson mentioned minimal wage. Minimal wage is useless if you have massive unemployment. Instead, what about minimal income? It's an idea that it's really discussed in some European countries. Now, can we extend it to countries rather than one country? If the effects of digital revolution is massive deindustrialization of specific countries, and we have populations sinking in poverty again? Can we afford it, you might say? Well, here inequalities again comes in the picture. There is so much wealth in the world, and it is, of course, as we know, all concentrated in very few people. So it may not be so unattainable, but it's a matter of daring to think how we will restructure, how we will address the effects of the transformation of the digital revolution. And my final controversial point is about payments for data. You might say, we have been striving for open data. We have been striving to have access to data without having to pay, and you're telling me to pay for data? You know, the data I talk about here is the data that it's taken from us without even knowing. And that creates huge wealth somewhere else. Our personal data, everything that we do is recorded by somebody. And we think it's nothing for us, although sometimes we worry about our privacy. And these kind of silly details, we might think, create the big data which is going to revolutionize your world. Here is another commodity. And I think we really need to think of how probably, if not individuals, the countries may need to be paid by those who utilize this data to create wealth for their own sake. So here are some provocative ideas, but I would like to hear from you, even though we don't have much time, but I really like to have your opinions on some of these ideas. Thank you very much.